That morning, the man I welcomed into my home slapped me across the face, and I chose silence. By evening, I had prepared a feast, fit for a king. My daughter smiled, relieved, thinking I had finally accepted my place as the servant. She whispered, "Finally, Dad understands." But she didn't know who was sitting at the head of the table or that the main course wasn't roast beef, but cold, hard justice. If you have ever felt betrayed by your own blood, take a deep breath, because this story might just be the therapy you need. Before I tell you how I served my revenge on a silver platter, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this old man share his truth. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I love reading your answers. The sound of porcelain shattering against the marble floor was like a gunshot in the quiet morning. I stood frozen in this kitchen, my arthritic hands trembling, looking down at the fragments of the antique blue and white serving platter. It was just a plate. An expensive one, sure, but just a plate. I bent down to pick up the pieces, my knees popping with the effort of 75 years of hard labor. I didn't hear him come in. I only felt the rush of air before the impact. Brandon, my son-in-law, didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if I was cut. He lunged across the kitchen island and swung his open palm with the full force of a man half my age. The slap connected squarely with my left cheek. The force of it sent my reading glasses skittering across the floor and knocked me backward against the refrigerator. My head spun. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my tooth had cut into my lip. I looked up dazed to see Brandon towering over me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was wearing his $3,000 Italian suit, the one I knew he had bought on credit, and his eyes were bulging. "You useless old parasite," he hissed, spittle flying from his mouth. "Do you have any idea how much that plate cost? That antique was worth more than your entire miserable existence." I touched my cheek. It was burning. I looked at this man, a man I had welcomed into my family, a man whose debts I had cleared, and I said nothing. I just stared at him. My silence seemed to infuriate him even more. He stepped closer, raising his hand again, as if to strike me a second time. "Look at me when I am talking to you, Harrison," he shouted. "You live under my roof. You eat my food. The least you can do is not destroy my property with your clumsy, shaking hands." Under his roof. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical stab in the gut. But before I could speak, before I could remind him exactly whose money had paid for this roof, for the marble floors he was standing on, and for the very suit on his back, I heard footsteps running down the stairs. It was Emily, my daughter, my little girl. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Emily would stop this. Emily, who I had raised alone after her mother died when she was just 6. Emily, for whom I had worked double shifts in my workshop, breathing in sawdust and varnish for 40 years, so she could have piano lessons and a college degree. She ran into the kitchen, her eyes wide. But she didn't run to me. She didn't look at the red mark blooming on her 75-year-old father's face. She didn't look at the blood on my lip. She ran straight to the broken porcelain on the floor. "Oh no," she gasped, dropping to her knees to inspect the shards. "Brandon, honey, is this the Ming platter, the one from the auction?" "It is gone, Emily," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a fake, weary tone, playing the victim instantly. "Your father decided to do the dishes again, even though I have told him 1,000 times to leave the expensive stuff to the housekeeper." Emily stood up and turned to me. Her expression wasn't one of concern. It was annoyance. Pure, exhausted annoyance. "Dad." Why, she asked, her voice high and whining. "Why do you always have to touch things? You know Brandon is under so much pressure with the new merger. You know he is stressed. Why do you have to provoke him like this in the morning?" I looked at her, truly looked at her. I searched for the little girl who used to cry when I got a splinter in my finger. She wasn't there. Standing in front of me was a woman who was terrified of her husband, a woman who had learned to trade her dignity for a lifestyle she couldn't afford. He hit me, Emily, I said, my voice raspy. He slapped me. Emily flinched, but she didn't turn on him. She looked at her shoes, then at the wall, anywhere but at me. You probably startled him, Dad, she muttered, wringing her hands. You know he has a temper when he is stressed. Just please go to your room. Don't make this worse. We have the dinner party tonight. My room. She meant the guest room on the first floor. The one next to the laundry room. The one that used to be a storage closet before they realized they needed a place to put me. I stood up straight. My cheek was throbbing, but my mind was suddenly clearer than it had been in years. For 2 years, I had been living in a fog of grief and confusion. 2 years ago, Brandon had come to me crying, saying he had made a bad investment, that he was going to lose everything, that Emily would be on the street. He needed $450,000. I didn't have that kind of cash lying around. But I had my house. The house in Oak Park where Emily grew up. The house I had built with my own hands, modifying it over 30 years until it was perfect. I sold it. I sold my sanctuary to save them. I gave them the money thinking I was saving my daughter's future. They invited me to live with them in their new mansion in the suburbs. They said, Dad, you will never have to worry about anything again. This is your home too. But it wasn't my home. I was the unpaid butler, the babysitter, the scapegoat, and now I was the punching bag. Brandon fixed his tie, regaining his composure. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes. Clean this mess up, Harrison, he said, and stay out of sight today. I have important people coming tonight. Mr. Sterling from the investment fund is coming to dinner. If this deal goes through, I will finally be rid of all these headaches. He looked at Emily. Make sure he doesn't embarrass us. I watched him grab his car keys and walk out the door without a backward glance. The front door slammed, shaking the house. Emily looked at me, tears finally welling in her eyes. But they were tears of self-pity, not empathy. Dad, please, she whispered. Just stay in your room tonight. I will bring you a plate later. I looked at the broken plate. I looked at my daughter, who was so broken inside she couldn't even see it. And something in me shifted. The old Harrison, the one who just wanted to keep the peace, the one who thought love meant sacrificing your dignity, that man died in that kitchen along with the blue and white porcelain. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a handkerchief to wipe the blood from my lip. I folded it neatly and put it back. No, Emily, I said. My voice was calm, unsettlingly calm. What she asked, confused. I said no. I am not staying in my room. Brandon has a big guest coming. A VIP. Yes, Mr. Sterling. It is make or break for Brandon. That is why he is so on edge. Good, I said. Then we must celebrate properly. You look tired, honey. Your hands are shaking. You go rest. I will handle dinner tonight. Dad, no, you don't have to, she began. I insist, I interrupted, walking past her to the pantry. I will make my signature bœuf bourguignon. It is a celebratory dish. Slow-cooked beef, red wine, mushrooms. It will be a meal Brandon never forgets. Emily looked at me, searching for signs of anger for the explosion she expected. But she saw only a flat, calm surface. She exhaled, relieved. She thought I had capitulated. She thought I was trying to make amends for breaking the plate. Okay, Dad, she said, kissing me on the cheek, avoiding the side Brandon had slapped. That would be helpful, thank you. Just please make it perfect. I watched her walk up the stairs to get ready for her day of leisure, leaving her 75-year-old father to clean up the mess her husband had made. Perfect, I whispered to the empty kitchen. Oh, don't you worry. It will be absolutely perfect. I picked up the dustpan and swept up the shards of the plate. As I dumped them into the trash, I caught my reflection in the window. The red mark on my cheek was turning purple. My white hair was disheveled. I looked like a victim. But as I stared at myself, I straightened my spine. I wasn't just a retired carpenter. I wasn't just a clumsy old man. I was Harrison Blackwood. And what Brandon and Emily didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask in all these years, was that before I was a carpenter, I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps. I knew how to hold a position. I knew how to gather intelligence. And I knew how to strike when the enemy least expected it. I walked over to the calendar on the fridge. Tonight, 7:00 p.m. Dinner with Mr. Sterling. I grabbed my coat and my car keys. I had shopping to do, but I wasn't going to the grocery store. Not yet. First, I had to make a stop at the Union Station train lockers. I had a file waiting for me there. A file I had commissioned a private investigator to compile 3 months ago when I first noticed Brandon whispering on the phone at 2 a.m. I had been hesitating to open it. I had been afraid of what I might find. I had wanted to believe there was still hope for this family. But that slap was the seal on the warrant. I drove out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. As I merged onto the highway toward the city, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't pain. It wasn't sadness. It was the cold, sharp clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose. Tonight I would serve dinner. I would serve the best meal they had ever tasted. And for dessert, I would serve the truth. But first, I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. I needed to know why a man who claimed to be a financial genius was so desperate for cash that he would hit an old man over a plate. I drove toward the city, my jaw set, my plan forming. The investigation was about to end, and the execution was about to begin. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Because what I found in that locker was not just about gambling debts or affairs. It was something far, far worse. Something that threatened not just my bank account, but the safety of my grandson Leo. And that was a line they should never have crossed. The Chicago wind off the lake cut right through my coat as I stepped out of my truck near Union Station. It was a biting cold that usually made my joints ache, but today I didn't feel a thing. Adrenaline is a powerful painkiller. I wasn't here to buy organic vegetables or artisanal bread for the dinner party. I was here to pick up the ammunition that would end the war my son-in-law had started this morning. The station was bustling with the midday rush, a sea of commuters with their heads down rushing to their next destination. I moved through them like a ghost. To them, I was just another old man in a worn canvas jacket, probably on his way to visit family, or maybe just looking for a warm place to sit. That was the advantage of being 75. You become invisible. People stop seeing the man and only see the age. Brandon certainly had. To him, I was furniture. Old, dusty, and easily discarded furniture. I made my way to the bank of lockers near the north exit. Leaning against a pillar, reading a newspaper, like we were back in Berlin in the 80s, was Jack. We had served in the Marines together, and while I went into carpentry, Jack went into intelligence and then private security. He was the only person in the world who knew the full extent of my life, the parts I kept hidden even from Emily. He didn't wave. He just folded the newspaper, picked up a thick manila envelope from the bench beside him, and walked toward me. As we passed each other, the handoff was seamless. No words were exchanged, just a brief, grim nod. I saw the look in his eyes, though. It was the same look he had given me 40 years ago when we found out our platoon was walking into an ambush. It was a look that said, "Brace yourself, Harrison. It is worse than you think." I took the envelope and walked to a quiet corner of the station, finding an empty bench facing the grand hall. I didn't open it immediately. I just held it, feeling the weight of the paper. This envelope contained the last 3 months of Brandon's life. His movements, his bank accounts, his secrets. I looked up at the high vaulted ceiling of the station. My eyes drifted to a high-end furniture advertisement displayed on a massive banner hanging from the rafters. It was an ad for Sterling Interiors featuring a handcrafted mahogany executive desk. A bitter smile touched my lips. Brandon loved that brand. He bragged endlessly about the Sterling chairs in his home office, about how they represented status and power. He had lectured me once, explaining that I wouldn't understand the quality of such things, because I was just a simple carpenter who fixed fences. The irony was so rich, it almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of the station. Brandon didn't know. Emily didn't know. Nobody knew. I wasn't just a carpenter. I was the founder of Blackwood Heritage, the very company that had designed and built the prototypes for that furniture line. I had started it in a garage with nothing but a set of chisels and an obsession with perfection. Over 30 years, I built it into a premier manufacturing empire. 10 years ago, when the Sterling Group approached me with a buyout offer, I took it. I sold the company for a sum that would make Brandon's knees buckle. But I had conditions. I kept a 15% stake in preferred stock, and I retained a permanent seat on the advisory board with veto power over design quality. I had walked away from the CEO title, but I hadn't walked away from the power. I kept it a secret from Emily. It was the hardest decision of my life. But I had seen too many of my wealthy friends' children turn into useless, entitled parasites, waiting for their parents to die so they could cash in. I wanted Emily to build her own character. I wanted her to find a partner who loved her for her, not for the millions her father had in a trust fund. I thought I was teaching her independence. I thought I was protecting her soul. Instead, I watched her marry a man who treated money as a god and people as disposable tools. I watched her shrink herself to fit into his materialistic world. I had sat on my fortune, living in their guest room, enduring their disrespect, waiting for them to show me a spark of decency. I kept waiting for Emily to stand up for me, or for Brandon to show a moment of genuine gratitude. I realized now that my test had failed, or perhaps it had succeeded in showing me exactly who they were. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. My thumb traced the seal. "You call me a parasite." Brandon, I thought my grip tightening on the paper. "You think I am a drain on your resources. You have no idea that the only reason your company, the one you claim to be a big shot, and even secured that contract last year was because I made a phone call to the board. I saved you, and you didn't even know it. But the saving stops today. I wasn't Harrison the old carpenter anymore. I wasn't the father-in-law who needed a place to stay. I was the majority shareholder. I was the man who could pick up a phone and end careers. And now, thanks to Jack, I was the man who knew where the bodies were buried." I ripped open the envelope. The sound of tearing paper echoed in my ears, like the first shot of a firing squad. I pulled out the first document. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a termination letter. My eyes scanned the page and the coldness in my chest spread. It was dated 6 months ago. Brandon hadn't just made a bad investment. He hadn't just hit a rough patch. He had been fired. Terminated for cause. I flipped to the next page and the picture became clearer and darker. Gambling debts. Massive ones. But not just to casinos. There were names here that didn't belong in corporate ledgers. Names that belonged in police files. I sat there in the middle of Union Station, surrounded by strangers, and realized that my son-in-law wasn't just a jerk. He was a criminal. And he had dragged my daughter and my grandson into the middle of a shark tank. I put the papers back in the envelope and stood up. My knees didn't pop this time. I walked toward the exit, my stride long and purposeful. I had a dinner to cook. And I had a guest list to update. Brandon wanted to impress Mr. Sterling tonight. He wanted to close a deal to save his skin. Well, he was going to get his meeting with Mr. Walter Sterling. But he wasn't going to like the agenda. I walked out into the cold Chicago air, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the chill. I felt the fire. It was time to go home. It was time to set the table. I sat in the cab of my truck, with the engine idling, to keep the heater running against the biting Chicago frost. The windows began to fog up, isolating me from the world outside, creating a small private confession booth where I was forced to confront the sins of my family. I pulled the rest of the documents from the envelope Jack had given me. My hands were steady now, but my stomach churned with a mixture of disgust and cold fury. The termination letter I had seen in the station was just the tip of the iceberg. As I turned the pages of the forensic accounting report, Jack's team had compiled the image of Brandon as a stressed but competent businessman, dissolved completely. He wasn't a financial wizard suffering from a market downturn. He was a common thief. The report detailed months of petty embezzlement from his former firm. He had been padding expense accounts, diverting client funds to pay for his leasing payments on luxury cars, and falsifying commission reports. He hadn't been let go because of downsizing. He had been fired for cause and was lucky they hadn't prosecuted him yet. They likely kept it quiet to avoid a scandal, simply kicking him out the door. But unemployment hadn't stopped his spending. The next section of the file was a list of debts that made my eyes water. It wasn't just credit cards, although those were maxed out to the tune of $50,000. It was the other names on the list that made my blood run cold. These weren't banks. They were names associated with loan sharks operating out of the back rooms of bars in the South Side. Brandon owed nearly $500,000 to people who didn't send overdue notices. They sent men with baseball bats. That explained the desperation. That explained the terror I had seen in his eyes right before he slapped me. He wasn't just stressed about a merger. He was fighting for his life. I reached into the envelope and found a small black flash drive taped to a piece of cardstock. Jack had written a simple note underneath it. Audio from his car. 3 days ago. I plugged the drive into the USB port of my truck's dashboard media system. The audio crackled to life. It was the sound of a car engine humming, followed by the familiar, arrogant voice of my son-in-law. He was on the phone, likely using the hands-free system. "Listen to me," he was saying, his voice tight with panic. "The meeting is set for Friday night. Sterling is coming to the house. I am going to pitch him on the high-yield fund. It is a Ponzi scheme, essentially, but he won't know that until the ink is dry. I just need his signature and the initial wire transfer. Once that money hits my account, I pay you, I swear." My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. He was planning to defraud Mr. Sterling. He was planning to steal from the very man who owned the company I had built. The audacity was breathtaking. But the recording wasn't over. There was a pause, and then Brandon spoke again, his voice lower, more sinister this time. "Yeah, the house is the backup, I know. But the old man is still living there. It complicates the sale. No, listen. I have a plan for him. After the dinner, once I secure the deal with Sterling, we are moving Harrison. There is a state facility on the outskirts, Greenview or something. It is cheap. Smells like bleach and despair, but it is affordable. I am working on the paperwork to have him declared incompetent. He is 75. Who is the court going to believe, a successful finance director or a senile old carpenter?" I stopped breathing. The air in the truck seemed to vanish. Greenview. I knew that place. It was a warehouse for the forgotten, a place where the elderly were drugged into submission and left to rot in soiled sheets. That was his plan for me. That was my reward for saving his family. He wasn't just going to kick me out. He was going to strip me of my rights, label me insane, and lock me away so he could sell the roof over my head to pay off his gambling debts. The recording continued. "Once he is out of the way, we list the house. It should fetch enough to cover the rest of the juice loan. Emily won't fight me on it. She does whatever I tell her. She is too scared of losing her lifestyle to care about her dad." The audio cut off. Silence rushed back into the truck, heavy and suffocating. I stared out the windshield at the gray parking lot. A tear leaked from my eye, hot and angry. It wasn't for me. It was for Emily. He spoke of her with such disdain, such absolute certainty of her weakness. And the worst part was that he was right. She had watched him slap me and blamed me for breaking a plate. I wiped the tear away roughly. My sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt like steel in my spine. Brandon thought he was playing chess. He thought I was a pawn to be sacrificed to save his king. He thought he could defraud Mr. Sterling, a man who respected me more than my own family did. He had no idea that the king he was trying to scam was already in checkmate. I ejected the flash drive and put it carefully into my pocket. This wasn't just evidence. This was the nail in his coffin. I had heard enough. I didn't need to know anything else. The man sitting at my dining table tonight wasn't just a failure. He was a predator, and predators needed to be put down. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life. I had a dinner to prepare. I had to buy the finest beef, the freshest mushrooms, the most expensive wine. Everything had to be perfect. Because tonight, Brandon wasn't just losing a deal. He was losing his freedom, and I was going to be the one to open the door for the police. I pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes dry and focused. I was going to cook the meal of a lifetime. It would be a last supper for the life Brandon knew. And as for the nursing home, I thought, as I merged into traffic, the only person going to a state facility would be him. And it wouldn't be a nursing home. It would be a federal penitentiary. I picked up the chef's knife from the block. It felt heavy and balanced in my hand. I had a dinner to cook, and I had a rat to catch. I turned the knife over, watching the light glint off the steel edge. The anger that had been a hot fire in my chest settled into something colder, something solid and unbreakable, like the ice on Lake Michigan. Brandon had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he could bully a child into silence. He thought his threats were the ultimate power in this house. He didn't realize that by threatening Leo, he had activated a part of me that I had buried since my days in the service. I wasn't just a grandfather anymore. I was a protector. And the threat was sitting in my living room, probably pouring himself a drink, thinking he had won. I started prepping the vegetables for the bœuf bourguignon. The rhythmic chopping of the carrots and onions was soothing. Chop, chop, chop. Each cut was precise. Each movement calculated. I wasn't just making a stew, I was constructing a trap. The aroma of searing beef and red wine began to fill the kitchen, a rich, comforting smell that masked the impending doom. As I cooked, I formulated the final steps of my plan. I needed to ensure that when the hammer dropped, there was no escape route. No way for Brandon to spin this, no way for him to blame it on stress or a misunderstanding. I needed absolute, undeniable proof broadcasted in real time. I remembered the small spy cameras I had installed weeks ago. I had put one in the study and one in the living room, hidden inside the smoke detectors. I had hesitated to use them, feeling like an old paranoid man invading his family's privacy. But now I thanked God for that paranoia. I wiped my hands on a towel and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened the app linked to the cameras. The feed from the study was dark, but the audio was crystal clear. I could hear Brandon pacing. I could hear him muttering to himself, rehearsing his pitch for Mr. Sterling. Then I heard the door open. Emily's voice drifted through the speaker. "Brandon, please," she sounded exhausted. "Dad is cooking dinner. Can't you just be nice tonight? Just for a few hours." Nice, Brandon's voice was a sneer. "I will be nice when that old man is out of my house. Do you know what Sterling said to me last week? He asked about my assets. He wants to know I'm liquid before he signs. If your father does not sign those papers declaring himself incompetent next week, we are dead in the water. I need control of his accounts, Emily. I need to liquidate his portfolio to cover the buy-in." "But the house," Emily whispered. "You said selling the house would be enough." "It is not enough," Brandon shouted, and I saw Emily flinch on the grainy video feed. "The house covers the debt to the investors. But I need operating capital. Your father has money sitting in that retirement account doing nothing. He is senile. He doesn't need it. We do." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. He wasn't just planning to send me to a nursing home. He was planning to drain every cent I had left, leaving me destitute in a state facility while he played the big shot with my life savings. And he was browbeating my daughter into being an accomplice. "Emily, listen to me," Brandon's voice dropped to a manipulative croon. "I am doing this for us, for Leo. Do you want Leo to grow up poor? Do you want him to be a nobody like your father?" "Don't talk about him like that," Emily said weakly. "I will talk about him however I want. He is a burden. And after tonight, if Sterling signs, we are moving forward. I have the papers drawn up. Dr. Evans owes me a favor. He will sign the competency evaluation without even seeing the old man. By Monday, Harrison will be a ward of the state, and we will be free." I put the phone down on the counter. My hand was shaking not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the evil I was witnessing. He had a doctor in his pocket. He had a plan to legally erase me. This wasn't just greed. It was a conspiracy. I went back to the stove. I added the pearl onions and the mushrooms to the pot. I poured in the rest of the wine. Let it simmer. Let the flavors meld. I walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to the guest room. I needed to get the file I had retrieved from the train station. I needed to make sure it was ready. I opened my suitcase and pulled out the manila envelope. I also took out a small velvet box. Inside was my Medal of Honor. I hadn't worn it in 50 years. I had kept it hidden, a relic of a past life. But tonight, I was going to wear it, not to show off, but to remind myself of who I was, to remind myself that I had faced men with guns and lived. A coward like Brandon didn't stand a chance. I pinned the medal to the inside of my jacket pocket, a secret talisman. Then I went to Leo's room. He was sitting on his bed, headphones on, drawing in a sketchbook. He looked up when I entered, his eyes wide and fearful. "Grandpa," I sat on the edge of the bed. "Everything is going to be okay, Leo. I promise." He looked at my arm. "Did you fix it?" "I am fixing it right now," I said. "Listen to me. Tonight during dinner, I want you to stay in your room. No matter what you hear, no matter how loud it gets, do not come downstairs. Do you understand?" He nodded. "Is Dad going to be mad?" "Dad is going to be occupied," I said carefully. "You just draw. Draw me a picture of a lion. A big, strong lion. Can you do that?" He smiled, a small, tentative thing. "Okay, Grandpa." I hugged him one last time, feeling the fragility of his small frame. I would burn the world down to keep him safe. I went back downstairs. The clock on the wall ticked toward 6:30. Mr. Sterling would be here in 30 minutes. The stage was set. The players were in position. The trap was primed. I walked into the dining room and began to set the table. I didn't use the everyday plates. I went to the china cabinet and pulled out the good stuff, the Wedgwood china that had belonged to my late wife. I polished the silverware until it gleamed. I set the crystal wine glasses. I placed 3 settings, one for Brandon at the head of the table, one for Mr. Sterling to his right, one for Emily to his left. And then I set a 4th place, directly opposite Brandon, at the other head of the table. Brandon came into the dining room adjusting his cufflinks. He stopped when he saw the 4th setting. "What is that?" he snapped. "Who is that for?" I looked him in the eye, my face a mask of calm servitude. "I thought I might join you, sir, just to ensure the service is seamless." He laughed, a cruel barking sound. "You join us. Don't be ridiculous. Clear that away. You eat in the kitchen." I didn't move. "Mr. Sterling is a man of the people," I said smoothly. "He might find it odd if the help isn't treated with respect." Brandon hesitated. He was nervous. He didn't want anything to throw off his rhythm. "Fine," he hissed. "Sit there. But keep your mouth shut. If you say one word, Harrison, one word that isn't more wine, I swear to God." He let the threat hang in the air. He didn't need to finish it. We both knew what he meant. The doorbell rang. Brandon jumped. He smoothed his jacket, took a deep breath, and put on his mask. The charming, successful businessman mask. "Showtime," he whispered to himself. He walked to the door. I stayed in the dining room, standing by my chair. I heard the door open. I heard the jovial greetings. "Mr. Sterling. So glad you could make it. Welcome to my humble home. And this must be your assistant, lovely to meet you." I listened to the footsteps approaching the dining room. I took a deep breath. The door opened. Brandon walked in, gesturing grandly to the table. "Please have a seat. My father-in-law has prepared a simple stew. I hope you don't mind." Mr. Sterling walked in. He was a tall man, silver-haired, radiating authority. Beside him was a woman I recognized instantly, though Brandon clearly didn't. She wasn't an assistant. Mr. Sterling's eyes swept the room. They landed on the table. They landed on the food. And then they landed on me. He stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth opened slightly. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute shock. He didn't look at Brandon. He walked straight past him, straight toward me. "Mr. Blackwood," he said. His voice filled with reverence. "Harrison. Is that you?" Brandon froze. His smile faltered. You know..." "My father-in-law," Brandon stammered. Mr. Sterling ignored him. He reached out and took my hand, shaking it firmly. "My God, sir. I haven't seen you since the board meeting in Zurich 5 years ago. I thought you were retired in Tuscany. What on earth are you doing here?" I smiled. A slow, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I am serving dinner, Mr. Sterling, and I believe we have a lot to discuss." Brandon looked from me to Sterling, his face draining of color. The realization that something was terribly, terribly wrong began to dawn on him. But he had no idea that the dinner bell wasn't ringing for a meal. It was ringing for his execution. The heavy cast-iron Dutch oven sat on the center burner, radiating a heat that felt steady and reliable against the cold draft seeping in from the hallway. I poured a little oil into the pot, watching it shimmer and dance as it reached temperature. This wasn't just dinner. It was a ritual. Boeuf bourguignon had been Emily's favorite dish since she was a little girl with missing front teeth and pigtails. I remembered her sitting at the old pine table in our Oak Park kitchen, her feet swinging, waiting impatiently for the stew that smelled like patience and love. She used to say it tasted like a hug. Tonight, I was going to give her a hug, but I was also going to burn her world to the ground so I could build a better one from the ashes. I took the cubes of beef I had carefully dried with paper towels. You have to dry the meat to get a good sear. If it is wet, it just steams and you lose that deep, complex flavor. It is a detail most people miss because they are rushing. Brandon was like wet meat. He had no substance, no sear, just a lot of steam and noise. I dropped the beef into the hot oil in batches. The sound was aggressive, violent even. The smell of browning meat instantly filled the kitchen, a primal, savory scent that usually promised comfort. As the meat browned, I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it on the granite countertop next to the cutting board. It vibrated silently. A text from Jack. "The asset is in place. She will arrive with Sterling." I smiled, turning a piece of beef with my tongs. The asset was Eleanor, a forensic accountant who had been working with the FBI on a task force investigating the very loan sharks Brandon was indebted to. Jack had pulled some strings, old favors from our days in the service, to get her assigned to this meeting. She wasn't just going to pose as Sterling's associate. She was going to be the witness to a federal crime. I typed a quick reply with my free hand. "Copy that. The trap is set." I removed the browned beef and set it aside. Now for the vegetables. I added the pearl onions and the carrots to the pot, letting them sweat in the rendered fat. The rhythm of the knife hitting the cutting board earlier had been the drumbeat of war. Now the simmering pot was the waiting game. I looked at the bottle of red wine standing on the counter. A Pinot Noir, robust and earthy. Brandon probably would have chosen something flashy and overpriced that tasted like oak chips. I pulled the cork and poured the entire bottle into the pot, deglazing the fond from the bottom. The steam rose up, carrying the scent of grapes and earth. It was intoxicating. While the wine reduced, I checked my email on the phone. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had sent the final draft of the trust documents. I had instructed him to set up an irrevocable trust for Leo, funded by the dividends from my hidden shares in Sterling's company. The house, once I reclaimed it from the bank after exposing Brandon's fraud, would go into that trust. Emily would have a roof over her head, but she wouldn't own a single brick. She couldn't be trusted with ownership. Not yet. She had to learn that security wasn't something you married. It was something you built. I scrolled down the legal document, my eyes scanning the clauses. Removal of guardianship in case of criminal negligence. That was the clause that would keep Leo safe. If Brandon went down and Emily faltered, I would step in. Legally, irrevocably. I confirmed the document with a tap of my finger. Sent. The wine was bubbling, reducing down to a syrup. I added the beef back in, along with the beef stock, the tomato paste, and a bouquet garni of fresh thyme, parsley, and bay leaves tied together with kitchen twine. I covered the pot and lowered the heat to the barest whisper of a flame. Now it just needed time. 3 hours of slow, gentle heat to break down the tough fibers of the meat and turn them into something tender and melting. It was a perfect metaphor for what I was doing to Brandon. I wasn't going to rush it. I wasn't going to scream and shout. I was going to apply steady, unrelenting pressure until he fell apart. The kitchen was warm now, filled with a rich, complex aroma that felt like home. It was a lie, of course. This house wasn't a home. It was a showroom for Brandon's ego, a hollow shell paid for with stolen money and my retirement fund. But for tonight, the smell would fool them. It would lull them into a false sense of security. They would smell the beef and the wine and think of family dinners and celebrations. They wouldn't smell the smoke of the bridge I was burning. I washed my hands, scrubbing the scent of onions from my skin. I looked at the clock. 6:15 p.m. I had 45 minutes before the curtain went up. My phone buzzed again. Another notification. This one was from my bank. A transfer alert. Brandon had tried to access my emergency savings account using the power of attorney he had forged last week. The transaction had been flagged and blocked because I had frozen the account this morning. I chuckled softly. He was desperate. He was checking cushions for loose change while the Titanic was sinking. He must be in his office right now, staring at an access-denied screen, sweating in his expensive suit, wondering why the old man's money wasn't flowing. He would be terrified. He would be dangerous. That was good. Fear made people sloppy. Fear made them arrogant. He would come to this dinner thinking he had to close Sterling at all costs. He would be so focused on the shark in front of him that he wouldn't see the whale surfacing beneath the boat. I dried my hands and picked up the tray of appetizers I had prepared earlier. Gougere, cheese puffs, simple, elegant, and deceptive. Air and dough, just like Brandon's promises. I walked to the swinging door that led to the dining room. I paused for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. Upstairs, Leo was drawing lions. In the master bedroom, Emily was likely trying to cover the red circles around her eyes with makeup. And in the study, Brandon was frantically trying to figure out which lie would save him. I pushed the door open. It was time to set the stage. The food was cooking. The evidence was gathered. The guests were on their way. And the chef was ready to serve the most expensive meal this family had ever eaten. It wouldn't cost money. It would cost them everything they thought they knew about me. The front door opened with a force that vibrated through the floorboards, shattering the quiet focus I had maintained in the kitchen. Heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood of the hallway, erratic and hurried. Brandon was home. He didn't call out a greeting to his wife or son. He marched straight toward the kitchen, the nerve center of his anxiety for the evening. When he pushed through the swinging door, he looked like a man whose internal wiring was starting to fray. His tie was loosened, hanging askew around a collar that was damp with sweat, despite the freezing temperature outside. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room as if he expected to find disaster. He didn't look at me as a person. He looked at me as a potential liability, a loose screw in a machine he barely knew how to operate. He walked over to the stove and lifted the lid of the Dutch oven without using a potholder, hissing as the steam hit his hand. He slammed it back down, the metallic clang jarring against the simmering quiet. "Is it ready?" he snapped, not bothering to look at me. "It is resting," I replied, my voice steady and low. "It needs 20 minutes to settle before serving. The flavors need to marry." He spun around, his face tight with a mixture of arrogance and terror. "I don't care about the flavors marrying, Harrison. I care about the timing. Mr. Sterling is punctual. If this dinner runs late, if the meat is tough, if the wine is corked, I am holding you personally responsible." He walked over to the counter where I had placed the bottle of Pinot Noir to breathe. He picked it up, inspecting the label with a critical sneer. It was a vintage bottle from my own collection, one I had saved from my cellar before selling the house. It was worth more than his car payment. "At least you didn't buy the cheap swill," he muttered, putting it back down. "Listen to me, old man. Tonight is not a family dinner. This is business. High-stakes business. Mr. Sterling is not just a guest. He is the key to my future. To our future." He took a step closer, invading my personal space. The smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat radiated off him. He pointed a finger at my chest, tapping it against the sternum where my heart beat slow and strong. "You are going to serve the food. You are going to pour the wine. And then you are going to fade into the background. Do you understand? I don't want you telling your boring stories about sawdust and wood shavings. I don't want you trying to be charming." I looked at his finger, then up to his eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't step back. "I understand perfectly." "Brandon," I said. He wasn't finished. The fear inside him was making him cruel, needing to exert dominance to quell his own panic. "If you embarrass me tonight, Harrison, if you open your mouth and say one word that jeopardizes this deal, the nursing home will look like a luxury resort compared to where I will send you. I will leave you on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Do not test me." It was a direct threat delivered with the venom of a cornered animal. He thought he was breaking me. He thought he was ensuring my obedience through fear. He had no idea that he was talking to a man who had already dismantled his entire life on paper and was just waiting to light the match. I reached for a towel and slowly wiped the counter, my movements deliberate. I looked him dead in the eye, letting a small, enigmatic smile touch my lips. It wasn't a smile of submission. It was the smile of a judge watching a guilty man perjure himself. "You have nothing to worry about," I said softly. "I will serve exactly what you deserve." Brandon paused. He frowned, trying to decipher the tone. For a second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He sensed something was off, a shift in the air pressure, but his arrogance quickly smothered his intuition. He scoffed, straightening his jacket and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Just do your job," he spat. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen, barking a name into his phone before the door even swung shut. I watched him go. He was walking to his execution, with his chest puffed out, convinced he was the king of the castle. I turned back to the stove. The timer on the oven beeped softly. The gougères were ready. Golden puffed and hollow. I took them out, the heat washing over my face. I arranged them on a silver platter. The guests would be arriving any minute. The stage was set. Brandon had given his orders. He wanted service. He wanted silence. And he wanted me to give him what he deserved. I picked up the platter. I intended to follow his instructions to the letter. I would give him exactly what he deserved. And it was going to be a dish best served cold. I waited until the heavy footsteps upstairs faded into the plush carpet of the master bedroom suite. The house fell into a tense, vibrating silence, the kind that hangs in the air before a thunderstorm breaks. I moved quickly, my movements precise and practiced. I wasn't just a chef tonight. I was a technician setting up the final stage of a demolition. I walked into the formal dining room. It was a cold, impressive space that Emily rarely used, dominated by a massive mahogany table that Brandon had bought to impress clients. On the far wall, mounted above a credenza, was an enormous flat-screen television. Brandon liked to use it to display dynamic art or live market feeds during his dinners, a constant glowing reminder of his self-perceived importance. He had bragged about the integrated smart system for weeks after installing it, mocking me when I asked how to turn down the volume. He thought I was a dinosaur, incapable of understanding anything more complex than a hammer. He had forgotten that I ran a manufacturing empire that utilized automated CNC machines and complex logistics software long before he learned to tie his expensive Italian shoes. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and opened the casting application Jack had installed for me. I tapped the screen, searching for the local network. There it was, the dining room hub. I entered the bypass code Jack had generated. The screen on the wall flickered once, a barely noticeable glitch, and then returned to its idle image of a rolling Tuscan landscape. On my phone, a small green icon appeared. Connected. I had total control. With a single tap, I could override whatever pretentious playlist Brandon chose and broadcast the video evidence I had compiled. I could show Sterling the footage of Brandon forging signatures. I could play the audio of him plotting to throw me into a state facility. I could turn this shrine to his ego into a courtroom. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, ensuring it was easily accessible. The digital trap was set. Now for the physical evidence. I went back to the kitchen island, where the manila envelope from Union Station lay next to the flour canister. It looked innocuous, just a bundle of papers. But inside was the forensic accounting of a criminal life. The embezzlement records, the loan shark debts, the guardianship papers for the nursing home. I picked up the heavy silver serving tray I had polished earlier. It was meant for the dessert course, a final flourish of elegance. I lifted the linen napkin lining the bottom and placed the thick envelope flat against the cold metal. I covered it carefully with the cloth, smoothing out the wrinkles until the surface looked pristine. I placed the crystal bowl of trifle on top, flanked by delicate silver spoons. To the naked eye, it was just a tray of sweets. But underneath the cream and sponge cake lay the warrant for Brandon's arrest. I would carry it out at the end of the meal, a final course that would choke him. I carried the tray into the dining room and placed it on the sidebar, just within arm's reach of the head of the table. It sat there, gleaming under the chandelier, a silent landmine waiting for a footstep. I checked my watch. 6:55 p.m. 5 minutes until 0 hour. I could hear movement upstairs again. The heavy tread of Brandon, likely pacing, checking his reflection, practicing his lies. The lighter, hesitant steps of Emily, probably wiping away tears and trying to find a smile to wear like a mask. And the silence from Leo's room, my brave boy drawing lions to keep the fear at bay. I adjusted my collar, feeling the cold metal of the Medal of Honor pressed against my ribs on the inside of my jacket. It was a secret weight, a reminder of the man I used to be, and the man I needed to be tonight. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing this to excise a cancer that was killing my family. I stood by the window looking out at the driveway. Headlights swept across the snow-covered lawn. A black limousine pulled up to the curb, its engine purring softly. The driver got out and opened the rear door. Mr. Sterling had arrived, and with him the storm. I turned my back on the window and walked to my position in the kitchen doorway. I folded my hands behind my back, lowered my head slightly, and waited. The trap was armed, the bait was laid, and the rat was about to walk right in. The doorbell chimed, a crisp electronic sound that signaled the beginning of the end. I watched from the shadows of the kitchen doorway as Brandon transformed. His shoulders straightened, his sneer vanished, and a plastic ingratiating smile plastered itself across his face. It was a masterclass in deception. He smoothed his tie one last time and pulled open the heavy oak door. "Mr. Sterling." "What an honor," Brandon boomed, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Thank you so much for coming out on such a cold night. Welcome to my home." Arthur Sterling stepped into the foyer, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. He was a man who commanded space without trying, tall and broad-shouldered in a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than Brandon's car. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the entryway with the detached appraisal of a man who bought and sold companies for sport. Beside him stood a woman who looked out of place in a business meeting, or so Brandon likely thought. She was stunning young, with sharp features and raven hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a black dress that was elegant but understated, clutching a slim leather portfolio. Brandon's eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second, too long, a mix of appreciation and dismissal. He clearly categorized her as eye candy, a secretary, or perhaps a mistress. He had no idea he was looking at a shark in high heels. "And this must be your associate," Brandon said, extending a hand to her. "I am Brandon." "Eleanor," she replied coolly, shaking his hand with a grip that made Brandon blink. "Just Eleanor." "Please come in, let me take your coats," Brandon said, bustling around them like a nervous bellhop. Emily appeared from the living room, her smile brittle and terrified. She smoothed her dress, her knuckles white. "Hello, I am Emily," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "So nice to meet you." Sterling nodded politely, handing his coat to Brandon. "A pleasure, Mrs. Vales. You have a lovely home." "Thank you," Brandon interjected quickly, tossing the expensive coats onto the bench rather than hanging them up properly. "We have put a lot of work into it. Please come through to the dining room. We have a wonderful evening planned." He led them down the hallway, walking with a strut that bordered on comical. He was guiding the lion into the den, convinced he was the tamer. I waited a beat, counting to 3, then picked up the heavy serving platter of appetizers. I took a deep breath, centering myself. The apron I wore was stained with a spot of wine, a badge of the servant role I was playing. I pushed through the swinging door into the dining room. The guests were just taking their seats. Brandon was pulling out a chair for Sterling, chattering mindlessly about the local real estate market. Emily was hovering near the sideboard, looking like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. I walked toward the table, my footsteps silent on the rug. "Here we are," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "Warm gougere to start." Brandon spun around. His eyes went wide with horror. He had explicitly told me to be invisible, to serve and fade away. Instead, I was standing right next to Mr. Sterling, holding the platter at eye level. For a second, the mask slipped. The charming host vanished, replaced by the tyrant who had slapped me that morning. He forgot Sterling was there. He forgot the deal. He only saw his defiance. "Old man," he snapped, his voice a harsh whisper that carried perfectly in the silent room. "I told you to wait in the kitchen. Put that food down and get out. You are not needed here." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room went deadly silent. Brandon realized his mistake instantly. He froze, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He turned slowly to Sterling, a nervous laugh bubbling up in his throat. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling. My father-in-law he is a bit confused sometimes. We try to keep him occupied with small tasks, but he forgets his place." He looked back at me, his eyes promising retribution later. "Go on, Harrison. Back to the kitchen." I didn't move. I didn't put the platter down. I looked at Brandon, then I turned my gaze to Arthur Sterling. Sterling wasn't looking at the food. He wasn't looking at Brandon. He was staring at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, ignoring Brandon completely. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden electric tension. Brandon looked between us, confused, his panic rising. "Mr. Muller?" Sterling, Brandon asked, his voice shaking. "Is something wrong?" Sterling didn't answer him. He took a step toward me, his eyes locked on mine. "Harrison." He whispered the name, hanging in the air like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man, and Brandon looked like he was already suffocating under the weight of it. Arthur Sterling did not wait for an answer. He moved around the massive mahogany table with an urgency that bordered on panic, pushing his chair back so hard it screeched against the floorboards. To Brandon's absolute horror, Sterling didn't just walk over to me, he practically bowed his posture, shifting from commanding CEO to respectful subordinate in the blink of an eye. "Mr. Blackwood, sir," he said, his voice trembling with genuine disbelief. "I apologize, I did not realize. Why are you serving food? I was under the impression you were inspecting the vineyards in Tuscany. The last report from the board said you were completely retired, living in Europe." I set the platter of gougères down on the table. With a soft clink, my eyes never leaving Brandon's face. The color had drained from my son-in-law's skin, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock, desperate for air that wasn't coming. "Plans changed, Arthur." I said, my voice smooth and controlled. I decided to stay closer to family, to see how my investments were being managed close up. Brandon finally found his voice, though it was an octave higher than usual, and cracked with hysteria. "Mr. Sterling, you must be mistaken. This is Harrison. He is my father-in-law. He is just a carpenter. He built the deck out back. He is not." He stopped because Sterling spun around and looked at him with a gaze so withering it could have peeled the paint off the walls. The warmth vanished from Sterling's face, replaced by the cold, hard steel of a man who ran a billion-dollar empire. "Just a carpenter." Sterling repeated the words like they were an insult to his intelligence. "You ignorant fool. This man is not just a carpenter. Harrison Blackwood is the reason you are sitting in a chair that costs more than your first car. He is the founder of Blackwood Heritage. He is the visionary who revolutionized sustainable manufacturing in this country." Sterling pointed a finger at me, but his eyes remained locked on Brandon. "He is the greatest teacher I ever had. Everything I know about quality, about integrity, about business, I learned in his workshop 40 years ago when I was nothing but a sweeping boy. And more importantly, he is the largest single shareholder of the Sterling Group. He owns the controlling interest in the very company you are trying to beg money from." The silence that returned to the room was different this time. It wasn't heavy. It was explosive. Emily let out a small, strangled sound, her hands flying to her throat, as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She looked at me as if she was seeing a stranger, as if the father she had treated like a servant for 3 years had suddenly removed a mask to reveal a king. Brandon looked like he was going to be sick. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his eyes darting frantically between me and Sterling, trying to process the magnitude of his error. The man he had slapped. The man he had called a parasite. The man he planned to throw into a state facility. That man owned him. Literally owned him. I picked up the bottle of wine from the sideboard. I walked over to Sterling's glass and poured a generous amount, the deep red liquid swirling in the crystal. "Please sit, Arthur," I said calmly. "My son-in-law went to great trouble to arrange this evening. It would be a shame to let the food get cold." Sterling hesitated, looking at me with concern. "Sir, if you are being mistreated here, if this man—" "Sit," I repeated gently, but with the command tone I hadn't used since the Marine Corps. "We have business to discuss." Sterling sat slowly, his eyes still full of questions. I walked around the table to the head, where Brandon was still standing frozen in his nightmare. I stopped right next to him. I could smell the fear coming off him in waves, a sour, acrid scent that overpowered the aroma of the stew. "I believe you are in my seat, Brandon," I whispered. He scrambled out of the chair so fast he almost tripped over his own feet, stumbling backward until he hit the sideboard. I pulled the chair out and sat down, settling into the head of the table. I adjusted my napkin, placing it across my lap. Now I said, looking around at the stunned faces of my family and the confused reverence of my business partner. Shall we begin? I unfastened the knot of the stained apron at my waist, the fabric sliding away to reveal the suit I had worn underneath a charcoal gray wool that fit me as perfectly today as it had when I addressed the shareholders a decade ago. I folded the apron neatly, placing it on the sideboard next to the untouched appetizers, a symbolic shedding of the servant's skin. Brandon stood trembling against the wall, watching me with the eyes of a cornered animal as I settled into the high-backed chair at the head of the table. The leather creaked softly, a sound of authority reclaiming its throne. You seemed concerned about your presentation earlier. Brandon, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. You told me this dinner was about closing a deal, about showing Mr. Sterling the reality of your assets. I think that is an excellent idea. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and placed it on the polished wood of the table. Let us look at the assets. I tapped the screen. The massive television on the wall behind me flickered, the serene image of the Tuscan countryside vanishing instantly. In its place, a high-definition video feed materialized, the timestamp in the corner, marking it as 7:14 a.m. that very morning. The audio was crisp, amplified by the surround sound system Brandon had been so proud of. The sound of shattering porcelain exploded into the room, making Emily jump in her chair. On the screen, everyone watched as the Brandon of 12 hours ago lunged across the kitchen island. They saw the rage in his face, the vein pulsing in his neck. And then with sickening clarity, they saw the slap. The sound of flesh striking flesh echoed off the dining room walls, a sharp, brutal crack that seemed to hang in the air long after the moment passed. In the video, my glasses flew across the floor. I stumbled back, and Brandon, the man, currently shivering by the sideboard, leaned over his 75-year-old father-in-law and spat venom. You useless old parasite. Do you have any idea how much that plate cost? That antique was worth more than your entire miserable existence. The video froze on a close-up of Brandon's snarling face. Arthur Sterling slowly turned his head to look at Brandon. The look on his face was not anger. It was something far worse. It was the absolute icy disgust of a man looking at something rotting. You struck him, Sterling said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a gavel. You struck the man who built the foundation you stand on. Brandon tried to speak, his hands fluttering uselessly in front of him. Mr. Sterling, please, it takes it out of context. He was being difficult. He broke an antique. It was assault. I interrupted, my eyes cold. But that is just the character reference, Brandon. Let's get to the business proposal. I tapped the phone again. The video changed. This footage was grainier, taken from the camera hidden in the smoke detector in Brandon's study 3 nights ago. It showed Brandon sitting at his desk, a single lamp illuminating a stack of legal documents. He wasn't alone in the video. He was on speakerphone with someone, a voice that sounded rough and impatient. I need more time, video. Brandon was pleading. The old man is stubborn, but I have a plan. I am putting him in a home next week. Once he is declared incompetent, I get power of attorney. On screen, Brandon picked up a pen. He pulled a document toward him. The camera zoomed in digitally, a feature Jack had ensured was top of the line. The document was a second mortgage application on this very house. But the house is in your wife's name, the voice on the phone growled. She needs to sign. She will sign whatever I tell her to, video. Brandon scoffed. But just in case. The room watched in horrified silence as Brandon practiced a signature on a scrap piece of paper. He wrote Emily Vales over and over again. Then, with a steady hand, he signed the mortgage document. There, video, Brandon said, holding up the forged paper. Done. The house is collateral. You will have your money once the bank processes this. I paused the video. Emily was making a sound I had never heard before, a low, keening whimper. She was staring at the screen, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her husband, not with fear this time, but with the shattering realization that the man she slept next to was a predator who had sold her safety to pay a gambling debt. "You forged my name," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You told me the house was paid off. You told me we were safe." Brandon lunged toward the table, panic overriding his senses. "That is a lie. That is deepfake. He is manipulating the video, Mr. Sterling. You can't believe this. This old man is senile. He is trying to frame me because I wanted to put him in a care facility. I didn't even flinch. I just reached for the silver tray I had placed on the sideboard. I lifted the crystal bowl of trifle and pulled away the linen napkin, revealing the thick manila envelope underneath. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the mahogany and stopped right in front of Arthur Sterling. "Open it, Arthur," I said. Sterling opened the envelope. He pulled out the forensic accounting report, the bank statements from the Cayman Islands, and the police report regarding the embezzlement from Brandon's previous firm. He scanned them quickly, his professional demeanor locking into place. "This isn't just bad management," son Sterling said, looking up at Brandon over the rim of his glasses. "This is a federal indictment waiting to happen. You have been laundering money through shell companies to pay off illegal gambling debts, and you were planning to use my investment fund to cover your tracks." Brandon was hyperventilating now. He backed away toward the door, his eyes darting around the room looking for an exit. "You can't prove that," he stammered. "This is all circumstantial. You have no jurisdiction here. You are just a businessman. I will sue you. I will sue all of you." He turned to the woman sitting next to Sterling. Eleanor, the woman he had dismissed as a secretary. "And you," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You are a witness to this harassment. I want your name. I am going to have your job." Eleanor stood up. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look confused. She moved with a fluid, lethal grace that made Brandon take a step back. She reached into her elegant black clutch and didn't pull out a notepad. She pulled out a badge. She flipped it open. The gold shield caught the light of the chandelier. "Special Agent Eleanor Vance, FBI Financial Crimes Division," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "And I am not a witness to harassment, Brandon. I am the lead investigator on the RICO case building against the syndicate you have been borrowing money from." Brandon hit the wall. His legs gave out and he slid down to the floor, a puddle of expensive fabric and ruined ambition. "Harrison reached out to us 3 weeks ago." Eleanor continued walking around the table to stand over him. "He provided the initial tip about the laundering. We have been tracking your transactions ever since. But tonight, you gave us everything we needed. The forgery, the confession on tape, the intent to defraud a federal investor. You are done." I looked at Brandon huddled on the floor of the dining room he had bought with stolen money. He looked small. He looked pathetic. The monster that had terrorized my grandson and slapped my face was just a greedy, frightened child. I stood up and walked over to him. I looked down my face, impassive. "You told me to serve you what you deserved, Brandon," I said quietly. I pointed to the badge in Eleanor's hand and the pile of evidence on the table. "Bon appetit." The silence that followed Eleanor's declaration was shattered by the wail of sirens cutting through the cold night air outside. The sound grew louder and more urgent, with every second penetrating the thick walls of the house Brandon had bought with dirty money. It was the sound of reality crashing into his delusion. Eleanor didn't wait for the uniformed officers to breach the front door. She moved with the efficiency of a predator securing its prey. She reached down, grabbed Brandon's wrist, and twisted it behind his back. The movement was so fast and precise that Brandon didn't even have time to struggle before his face was pressed against the hardwood floor he was so proud of. The metallic ratchet of the handcuffs locking into place was a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the dining room. It was a cold, final sound, the click of consequences arriving. Brandon let out a howl of rage and pain that didn't sound human. It was the sound of a man watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. Two uniformed officers burst into the room, their radios crackling with static. They moved to assist Eleanor hauling Brandon up from the floor. He was a mess. His expensive suit was rumpled and covered in dust from the floor. His hair was wild, plastered to his forehead with sweat. The arrogance that had defined him just hours ago was gone, replaced by a feral, terrified desperation. As the officers gripped his arms, Brandon looked around the room, searching for a scapegoat. His eyes landed on Emily, who was still sitting at the table, frozen in shock, tears streaming silently down her face. "This is your fault," Brandon screamed, spitting the words at his wife. "You and your constant demands. You wanted the big house. You wanted the club membership. You wanted the lifestyle. I did this for you. I borrowed that money to keep you happy, because you are nothing but a leech." Emily flinched as if he had struck her physically. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no sound came out. She just shook her head slowly, looking at the man she had shared a bed with for 10 years, as if he were a complete stranger. Brandon wasn't finished. He thrashed in the grip of the officers, turning his head to look at me. His eyes were filled with a hatred so pure it was almost tangible. "And you," he hissed. "You planned this. You set me up. You entrapment. You old snake. You sat there in my house eating my food, plotting against me. I should have thrown you out the window this morning instead of just slapping you. I should have finished the job." The officers tightened their grip, forcing him toward the door, but I raised a hand. "Wait." The room went quiet, save for Brandon's heavy, ragged breathing. I walked slowly around the table. I didn't rush. I moved with the weight of my 75 years and the authority of the position I had kept hidden for so long. I stopped directly in front of him. I looked at the red mark on his wrist, where the handcuffs were digging in. I looked at the sweat on his upper lip. I looked into his eyes, which were darting around, looking for an escape that didn't exist. I remembered the morning. I remembered the stinging pain on my cheek. I remembered the feeling of helplessness that had washed over me, the feeling that I was small and weak. But looking at him now, I realized I had never been the weak one. He was. He was weak because he thought power came from force. He thought authority came from fear. "You are right about one thing, Brandon," I said, my voice low and steady, barely above a whisper, but carrying to every corner of the room. "You did slap me this morning. You laid your hand on an old man because you thought you were untouchable. You thought that because you were younger and richer and louder, that you were the king of this world." I stepped closer, invading his space just as he had invaded mine in the kitchen earlier that day. "But you forgot the first rule of being a man. You never strike someone who cannot strike back unless you are prepared for the universe to strike back for them. You used your hand to hurt me when the sun was coming up. You used physical violence to silence the truth." I pointed to the badge hanging around Eleanor's neck and then to the officers holding him. "But now the sun is down, and in the dark, the rules change. You hit me with your hand. But tonight the law is hitting you back. And unlike me, the law doesn't bruise. It breaks." Brandon stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The reality of his situation finally seemed to penetrate the thick wall of his narcissism. He wasn't arguing with a father-in-law anymore. He was arguing with his fate. "Get him out of my sight," I said to the officers. They began to drag him away. He didn't scream anymore. He just started to sob, a pathetic, broken sound that grated on the nerves. As they hauled him through the doorway past the uneaten gougere and the cold beef stew, he looked back one last time. He looked at the luxury house he was leaving, likely forever. He looked at the wife he had betrayed. And he looked at me, the old carpenter, who had just dismantled his life with a dinner party. The front door slammed shut, cutting off his sobbing. The silence that rushed back into the house was deafening. The sirens outside began to fade as the police cars pulled away, taking the cancer of this family with them. I turned back to the table. Mr. Sterling was standing buttoning his jacket. He looked shaken, but there was a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "I am sorry it had to end this way, Harrison," he said quietly. "But you did the right thing. The company will cooperate fully with the investigation. We will make sure every dime he stole is accounted for." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "I appreciate you coming. And I apologize for the dinner. I am afraid the beef is cold." Sterling managed a small, tired smile. "Under the circumstances, I think I have lost my appetite. But Harrison, please call me next week. We need to discuss your seat on the board. It has been empty for too long." I nodded. "I will." Eleanor stepped forward. "We have a lot of paperwork to go through, Mr. Blackwood. But for tonight, the site is secure. We have agents monitoring his accounts. He isn't going anywhere but a holding cell. You and your family are safe." Safe. It was a strange word. The physical threat was gone, yes. But looking at Emily, who was still staring at the empty doorway where her husband had just vanished, I knew the real work was just beginning. The storm had passed, but now we had to live in the wreckage. I walked the guests to the door, thanking them for their role in this painful theater. When the latch clicked shut, locking out the cold night, I turned back to the hallway. I was alone with my daughter. The house felt enormous and empty. The smell of the rich stew still hung in the air, a ghostly reminder of the celebration that never happened. I walked back into the dining room. Emily hadn't moved. She was trembling, her hands gripping the tablecloth so hard her knuckles were white. She looked small. She looked like the little girl who used to scrape her knees, waiting for her daddy to fix it. But I couldn't fix this with a bandage and a kiss. This wound was too deep, and this time she had to be the one to stop the bleeding. I walked over to her, my footsteps heavy on the floor. It was time for the second course of this meal. The course that tasted bitter but was necessary for survival. It was time for the truth. The silence in the dining room was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on us. The police sirens had faded into the distance, taking Brandon away, but the wreckage he left behind was still sitting at my table. Emily sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap, staring at the empty chair where her husband had been sitting just minutes ago. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped, hairline fractures running through her composure, threatening to shatter her completely. I stood by the sideboard watching her. My heart ached. Every instinct as a father screamed at me to go to her, to wrap her in my arms, to tell her that everything was going to be all right, that Daddy would fix it. I had been fixing it for 38 years. I fixed her scraped knees, her broken toys, her failed science projects. I paid for her mistakes, smoothed over her conflicts, and shielded her from the harsh edges of the world. And look where that had gotten us. It had raised a woman who stood by and watched her husband slap her elderly father across the face, and then blamed the father. It had raised a mother who was so paralyzed by fear and dependency that she allowed a man to threaten her own son with military school just to keep a secret. If I comforted her now, if I told her it was okay, I wouldn't be saving her. I would be dooming her. I would be confirming that she was a victim who needed rescuing rather than a woman who needed to find her own strength. Emily slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed with the black smudges of ruined mascara. She slid off her chair, her movements uncoordinated and clumsy, and fell to her knees on the hardwood floor. She didn't try to stand up. She just stayed there, kneeling among the table legs, her head bowed low. "Daddy," she sobbed, the word cracking in the middle. "I am so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the forgery. I didn't know about the embezzlement. I am so sorry. Please forgive me." She reached out a hand toward me, grasping at the hem of my trousers like a drowning swimmer reaching for a lifeline. I looked down at her. I didn't pull away, but I didn't reach down to help her up either. I let her stay there on her knees. It was a cruel image, perhaps, but necessary. She needed to feel the hardness of the floor. She needed to feel the reality of her position. "You didn't know about the forgery, Emily." I said, my voice low and steady, devoid of the warmth she was begging for. "I believe you. But you knew about the slap. You saw him strike me. You saw the blood on my lip. And you told me to go to my room so I wouldn't embarrass him." She flinched, her head bowing lower, her shoulders shaking with fresh sobs. "I was scared," she whispered. "He was so angry. I just wanted to keep the peace." "Peace is not the absence of conflict, Emily," I said sternly. "Peace is the presence of justice. And there has been no justice in this house for a very long time. You traded your dignity for a luxury car and a country club membership. You traded your father's safety for a quiet morning. And worst of all, you were ready to trade your son's well-being to protect a criminal." She looked up at me, then her face twisted in anguish. "No, never, Leo. I love him. Love is action, not a feeling," I countered. "Brandon threatened to send him away. You knew he was scared. You saw the bruises I found. And you did nothing. You let the wolf live in the sheep pen because you were afraid of being alone." I took a step back, breaking the contact with her hand. I walked over to the table and picked up the manila envelope Sterling had left behind, the evidence of Brandon's crimes and the proof of my own hidden life. "This house," I said, gesturing to the high ceilings and the expensive art. "This house was bought with lies and maintained with stolen money. Brandon forged your signature to mortgage it to the hilt. It is technically in foreclosure as of this morning, or it would be if I hadn't stepped in." Emily's eyes widened. "We are losing the house." "No," I corrected her. "You are losing the house. I am reclaiming it." I walked back to her, standing tall. "I used my connections and my capital to buy the debt from the bank this afternoon. As of right now, I am the sole owner of this property." She let out a breath of relief, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "Oh, thank God. Thank you, Dad. I knew you would save us. We can stay here. We can make it work. I will be better, I promise." I shook my head slowly. The hope on her face was painful to witness, because I was about to crush it. "No, Emily. You are not listening. I said I reclaimed the house. I didn't say you were staying in it." The smile vanished. "What? This house is going into an irrevocable trust for Leo." I stated, my voice hard as iron. "It will be his when he turns 25. Until then, it will be rented out, and the income will go into his education fund. You are not living here." But where will I go?" she stammered, panic rising in her voice. "I have no money. Brandon emptied our accounts. I haven't worked in 10 years. I have nowhere to go." "I know," I said. "And that is exactly why you have to leave. You have become comfortable being helpless. You have relied on men to provide for you, to define you, to tell you who you are. First me, then Brandon. You went from my house to his house without ever standing on your own 2 feet." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They weren't the keys to this mansion. They were the keys to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the city. I had rented it yesterday under my name, paying the first 6 months of rent. It was clean, safe, and completely unglamorous. I tossed the keys onto the table. They landed with a heavy clatter next to the cold beef stew. "That is an apartment on 42nd Street, I said. "The rent is paid for 6 months. There is furniture. There is a fridge. There is a bus stop on the corner. That is all you get." Emily stared at the keys, as if they were a venomous snake. "Dad, you can't be serious. You have millions. Mr. Sterling said you were the majority shareholder. You could buy me a house. You could give me an allowance. Why are you punishing me? I am not punishing you," I said, my voice cracking slightly with the emotion I was holding back. "I am teaching you. I am doing the job I should have done 20 years ago. I am forcing you to grow up." I leaned down, getting close to her face, making sure she heard every word. For the next 2 years, I will not give you a single dime. Not for clothes, not for food, not for a car. You are going to get a job. Any job. You are going to wake up early, work hard, and pay your own bills. You are going to learn what a dollar is actually worth when you have to sweat for it. She started to protest, but I cut her off. If you need food, you will earn it. If you need clothes, you will buy them at a thrift store. I will pay for Leo's school and his medical needs directly. But not a penny goes through your hands. You have 6 months of free rent to get on your feet. After that, you are on your own. But I can't, she wailed. I don't know how. Then you will learn, I roared, the volume of my voice making her jump. You are smart, Emily. You are capable. You just forgot because it was easier to be weak. You are going to learn to respect yourself, and you are going to learn that you don't need a husband or a father to survive. You only need yourself. I stood up straight, adjusting my jacket. I will take Leo to my hotel tonight. You pack your things. Take what you need, but leave the expensive furniture, the art, the jewelry Brandon bought with stolen funds. Those are evidence. You leave tomorrow morning. I turned my back on her and walked toward the door. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every step away from her felt like tearing off a limb. I could hear her crying behind me, a desolate, frightened sound. But I kept walking. I had to be strong enough for both of us. I stopped at the doorway and looked back one last time. She was still kneeling, clutching the keys to the small apartment in her hand. One day, Emily, I said softly. One day you will understand that this is the only way I could save you. You have to save yourself first. I walked out into the hallway and climbed the stairs to get my grandson. The dinner was over. The lesson had begun. And for the first time in a long time, I had hope. Not the soft, easy hope of a dream, but the hard, gritty hope of a man who knows that the fire that burns the forest is also what allows the new seeds to grow. The morning mist curled off the surface of Lake Geneva, creating a blanket of silence that felt sacred. I sat on the end of the wooden dock, my legs dangling over the water, holding a fishing rod with a loose, easy grip. Beside me, Leo sat with his own rod, his eyes focused intently on the red and white bobber floating in the stillness. He wasn't drawing lions to hide from fear anymore. He was learning patience. He was learning that good things come to those who wait, not those who take. It has been exactly 1 year since the night the police took Brandon away. 12 months since I served a dinner that destroyed a family to save it. Brandon is currently serving the first year of a 10-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. I haven't visited him. I don't intend to. He is a ghost, a bad memory, that is slowly fading from my grandson's eyes. Got one, Leo whispered, his voice filled with a thrill that didn't need to be shouted. He reeled it in a small but spirited sunfish. I watched him unhook it gently and release it back into the water. He didn't need to keep it. He just needed to know he could catch it. Yesterday I stopped by the bakery on 4th Street. The smell of yeast and sugar was thick in the air. Through the display window I saw Emily. She was wearing a white apron covered in flour, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, sweat glistening on her forehead, as she kneaded a massive mound of dough. She looked tired. She had dark circles under her eyes that makeup didn't cover because she wasn't wearing any. But when she looked up and saw me, she smiled. It wasn't the brittle, terrified smile of the woman who lived in the mansion. It wasn't the fake smile of a trophy wife trying to please a tyrant. It was a real smile. A tired, honest, beautiful smile. She bought her own car last month. It is a used sedan with a dent in the bumper, but she paid for it with money she earned waking up at 4 in the morning to bake bread. She pays her own rent. She buys her own groceries. And for the first time in her life, she walks with her head high. She isn't afraid of losing everything anymore because she knows she can build it back up with her own 2 hands. I walked into the bakery and ordered a coffee. She tried to give it to me on the house. I put a $5 bill in the tip jar and told her that labor deserves reward. She laughed, and the sound was like music. We are rebuilding. Slowly, brick by brick. It is not perfect, but it is real, and reality is the only foundation worth building on. I looked at Leo, the sunlight catching the gold in his hair. I looked at the lake, vast and deep. I touched my cheek, the place where Brandon had slapped me a year ago. The physical pain was gone long ago, but the memory remained a reminder of the moment everything changed. People often mistake kindness for weakness. They mistake silence for submission. They think that because you are old or quiet or patient, you are defenseless. They think morality is a soft blanket you hide under. They are wrong. Morality is not weakness. It is the steel frame inside the concrete. It is what keeps you standing when the world tries to knock you down. Sometimes to win the war, you have to lose a battle. Sometimes you have to stand still and let a lesser man strike you. You have to take the slap. You have to swallow the insult. You have to let them think they have won. Because while they are celebrating their petty victory, while they are drowning in their own arrogance, you are gathering your strength. You are sharpening your truth. You are preparing the main course. And when the time is right, you don't need to shout. You don't need to use your fists. You just need to serve the truth, because the truth is the only punch that knocks them out for good. And trust me, nothing tastes sweeter than a justice you cooked yourself. If there is one thing this old carpenter has learned in 75 years, it is that true power does not need to roar. It whispers. My son-in-law thought strength was a loud voice and a heavy hand. He thought wealth was a shield for his cruelty. But he learned the hard way that character is the only currency that truly matters in the end. Do not let anyone mistake your silence for surrender, or your kindness for weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the keys. Protect your dignity, protect the ones who cannot protect themselves, and never be afraid to walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories from a life well lived. And tell me in the comments below, have you ever had to teach someone a lesson they would never forget? I read every single one.